Could we have the staff for item 24 at the end of the table, please? So we have Chief Planning Officer Mike Teelan, and who else have we got? Yes, yeah, no, that's fine. If we can bring up enough chairs. Right.
Thank you. So just to introduce two councillors and staff who are here with me today. So on my right, your left, Helen Beaumont, who is our Natural Environment Heritage Unit Manager, Peter Doolan, who's the Project Manager for the Port Hills work, Ian Wright, who's the council's Senior Geotech Engineer, and Dave King, who's a senior expert quantity surveyor. We've got Don McFarlane from URS, who led a lot of the review work. He's currently trying to get here at this stage, so that's who's here.
Thank you. Would you like to take us through the report before we open it up for questions?
So this was a report on as an outcome of council's request at the end of last year for staff to look at the feasibility of area-wide mitigation being applied to the Port Hills, and it was a piece of work that has been undertaken. So at the outset, as has been explained to council in the workshop, we established a number of parameters to look at that. So at the high level, they looked largely at things such as we needed to have more than 2 privately owned properties that could be protected in a locality, because obviously if we were only dealing with a single property, we were looking at there's already individual rockfall protection available to those people following the council's resolution in December 2012. We also looked at also some working parameters for that analysis. So at a macro level, the work had to be technically feasible. We looked at applying the solution to that as being in the working with a location that was the best for the properties to be protected. That may not necessarily be the most convenient, but it had to be the best location. And fundamentally, one of the key ones was that we looked at a number of models around how you could deal with the fact that large portions of the land were increasingly being owned by the Crown, and over 80% of the properties that were red zoned are now owned by Sarah. One of the I suppose the fundamental parameters we started with was we looked at those properties where, and I suppose in some respects it's shown on the diagram in page 3. We did not look at because we were looking on the basis of the council making use of its otherwise 50% contribution to a red zone buyout as the basis for the analysis. We did not look at undeveloped land, so land where there was no housing on it. We also did not look at land that was owned by the Crown, because the council was already liable for its 50% contribution to the Crown for that purchase that has been made. What we did not, however, what we did include were those properties that may have already been owned by the Crown but were could incidentally benefit from rockfall protection structure. So if you look at the little map on page 3, you'll see that there's 2 groups of eligible properties. There's a little property in between that may be owned by the Crown, but if that was incidentally protected by a potential rockfall mitigation structure, that was incorporated in our analysis. We also then so having defined the areas we were looking at, and you'll note from the report that there were 5 nodes that were identified as having properties or groups of properties that fitted that criteria, we then looked at what was the most feasible method of protection, and that fundamentally is either, in this case, a bund or a fence, and Ian Wright can talk to that if required. And then we looked at the cost of providing those, and the cost, as you will well be aware, is around the cost of construction, the cost of maintenance, the cost of getting the land to actually site those developments on. That was a piece of work that was undertaken, and there were a range of costings developed. And obviously, I know it's been contentious before. When we looked particularly at rock fences, we looked at not only what was the cost of establishing them, but because they require regular maintenance, the cost of maintaining those, particularly over their 50-year lifespan. And as we know that from some of the failures that happened on the Port Hills, some of the fences that have failed historically have been because either they were improperly specified or they were not maintained in a manner that meant that they had a high level of engineering security. That was the work that was undertaken. Of the 5 nodes that we looked at, none of the nodes had a BCR better than 1, so none of the nodes actually, the cost that council, the benefit of establishing that not outweigh the cost of actually contributing the 50% that the council was working at its basis. One of the key elements that we identified early on is that one way to perhaps address the BCR was to, in broad terms, extend the range of properties that could be protected. And invariably that led you to a conversation with the Minister and the Crown about what was the Crown's attitude to incorporating its properties into any form of area-wide mitigation. The Minister and the Mayor subsequently met, and a number of questions were put to the Minister, and they largely formed in high, broadly they were, would the Crown would be interested in making its land available to benefit from area-wide protection, so would it reintroduce potentially development up there? The second question is, would it allow, if it was not going to participate, would the Crown consider allowing its land to be used for rockfall protection structures to be sited on it? And the third question was, if neither of those applied, would the Crown be interested in allowing its land to be used for access for the purpose of building some area-wide mitigation? The advice that we've had back, and the letter's been circulated last night to you from Sarah, is that the Minister has previously made his decision on not supporting area-wide mitigation and is not interested in allowing the Crown land to be used for that purpose, will not allow Sarah land to be used for area-wide mitigation structures, and I think remains open to using it for access should that be an outcome that can be achieved. On that basis, the staff recommendation to you is that we do not consider that area-wide mitigation basically fundamentally meets the criteria that were established, and that fundamentally the council should continue to offer individual rockfall protection structure outcomes, and that's been available for some time, and a number of landowners are working through that process, but that area-wide mitigation not be pursued any further by the council.
I assume that there were some questions. Do you want to? Yeah, I know that Yanni tabled some questions yesterday, which you've provided a written response to quite late in the day, so we might, but I think everyone got a copy of those.
I think so.
Yeah, so, but kick it off, Yanni.
Okay, thank you. So several questions, and thank you for the work that you've done to date. First question really is around the cost share agreement. My reading of the cost share agreement, it says 3.3, the parties agree that if a cost-effective engineering solution can be identified and agreed by the parties, which will reduce the life risk from rock fall or rock roll, so that the Port Hills RRZ is no longer applicable to that area, the cost of giving effect to the agreed solution will be shared equally between them. So what that tells me in terms of the agreement we've got with the Crown, it's not a case of them saying no, it's actually a case of us working out a cost-effective solution. I don't quite understand. The minister's basically saying, is he going against the cost share agreement? I don't understand how he can just unilaterally decide not to give effect to what we've agreed to in the cost share.
Well, I can't answer. I mean, I haven't got the cost share in front of me, and I'm not.
Right.
I don't have that material. I don't know that. I mean, my understanding is that the minister basically has been consistent in an approach. The concept area-wide mitigation was rejected by him early on, and that's the red zone was the result of that. And he's participating and pursuing his policy of buying out land in the red zone or making that offer to individuals who want to take advantage of that.
So
I think that's his policy framework for solving what he believes are the issues of high risk in the Port Hills.
Yeah, I know the report says that that Port Hills councillors met with the minister, but we didn't. I think it was just the mayor. It may have been. There might have been others, but certainly not all.
I think it was just the smaller group of councillors that.
Yeah,
met
so
with them.
I acknowledge that's incorrect in the report.
So I don't know if anyone at that meeting was aware of what was in the cost share, but it seems to be one of the unresolved issues. Is the cost share agreement? The report that went to council is vastly different to the cost share agreement. The report that went to council that council agreed to sign up to, in terms of the cost share, said that all land adjacent to council reserves would be vested in council. What the signed cost share agreement says is up to 50%. Have you had any explanation or been able to understand who changed it, why they changed it without any mandate from council, and what the government's view is on that?
Yeah,
I don't think that that's a question that our Chief Planning Officer can answer. I mean, it's not.
No, and I can't answer. And thank you for sending that material to me last night. But I mean, the perhaps two comments I'd make on that, without being able to directly answer that. One is, I suppose, the council's contributing 50% of the cost of the red zone buyout. So there may be a reason why the Crown has come back and said, well, actually, you're potentially up to 50% of the land, because we're not the 100% purchaser of that land. But I think I would also come back to the comment I also made that I think certainly from the work that we've done technically, I think there would be some real questions about whether it would actually be sensible or reasonable for the council to want to have all that 100% of all that land, because I think we would be interested in that land, and we've traditionally been interested in that land where it provides better access to our reserves as opposed to simply taking on additional land. Now that's not quite a direct answer, but it's a view that I think technically we hold.
Right. So, but I mean, maybe it's more of appropriate for the acting chief executive. Does anyone know how? I mean, because it kind of concerns me with the cost share that you had a report that went to council that council agreed to, and then these changes have been made after we'd already agreed with government. So I think at some stage it would be worth trying to get either information from the previous chief executive or the government over why that was changed to what we'd already agreed with government, so that we at least can understand why that's happened, because I still don't have any sense of it.
That's fine.
I think there's also an issue around, as I understand, we've paid nothing for the rockfall cost to the Crown. So I don't quite know what the process is. So, we're spending money on the property's acquisition or mitigation, which was what we agreed as council. What is the process for us either getting half the land or all the land and paying?
Well, I think that's certainly a process in the future. So where we have agreed to contribute to individual rockfall protection structures, the presumption there is that those people will obviously are staying there, so will not be accessing the government's red zone buyout offer. So that's the end of our liability to those property owners and the Crown's presumably, because the Crown won't need to pay anything for those. I think, as I pointed out in the notes I gave back to councillors last night, the process for buying out and for us paying and then ultimately agreeing what land gets transferred to council is something that I think the Crown has indicated they will only look at once the buyout offers have expired, they have resolved the residual issues they have with insurances on the properties they've purchased, and have finalised their future land use policy for the Port Hills. So I think at that point we will be in a position to understand what financial contribution we need to make, because we don't know the total sum of that yet, but also identify and work with the Crown to identify what land the council actually does want and how that might be transferred to us. I think that's still a process that's likely to take place in late 2014, 2015.
We've just heard that one of the S124s has been overturned, so that person is then able to return. There's properties below that we heard, even though it's owned by Sarah, that possibly could have an S124 removed, could be houses that people could be living in. So what work have you done on the basis of, do we do any work as a council when S124 gets overturned to reassess other S124s in that area, recognising that, you know, we've got a housing issue in the city, that we've got, if we've had something challenged, overturned, maybe some of our other assumptions aren't quite as correct as they should be. So what process have we put in place following the overturning of the S124 to look at that area?
I know that at one point we did go through and review our S124s, but we do not have an ongoing program of reviewing each one of them as an individual gets turned over or confirmed. I mean, we've had 2 that have been overturned. I don't know how many have been confirmed. There's only a handful in the process. I think there's 15 altogether. So by far the majority of them are simply remaining there. And either have then evaporated because they've transferred in as a contestable issue because they've transferred into the Crown ownership. So no, we don't go through and then say, okay, on the basis of that determination, what are the other 124s?
And then the final question was the issue of liability. Just help me understand, if someone's hasn't taken up the volunteer offer in the red zone and they're staying there, then what is the liability situation with council? If we don't do rockfall mitigation, are we basically having an increased liability because we know there's a hazard and we've done nothing to address it?
I'm probably not in a position to answer. I understand perhaps Mr Mitchell may be in a position to answer that because there was some legal work done by Mr Gilbert on that issue of liability from Mr Mitchell. Can't answer that.
Not on this topic at the moment. No, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the key that we have is, the key that we have going forward, I suppose, is to ensure that our district's plan provisions are adequate to manage future development on those Port Hills. Now, and that's why I suppose the work that the council's been doing has been saying we need to take a more having had the change events and knowing what we know now, we need to take a more precautionary event going forward. We can't undermine people's existing use rights, but we can manage development in the future on the Port Hills. And so the work that we're doing on the district plan will actually essentially make it more difficult for future development to occur in high-risk areas.
But I think that the point that Councillor Johansson raises is a good one. I think we probably do need to get some legal advice about what our obligations are to people, because I mean at the moment the residential red zone is just a measure to enable people to accept a voluntary offer from central government. So it's not a zoning.
No, the red
rule.
zone certainly. That's correct. The red zone certainly isn't.
So what is our legal obligation is actually a really good question to have answered. So I think if we could just make a note of that, it may form part of the resolution that we finally pass.
Yes, I think so, Madam Chair. I think we do need to distinguish that the council basically undertook and made decisions on the basis of the knowledge that it had around risk at the time, and made reasonable decisions based on that risk profile. Obviously, that's changed, and so we need to understand that.
It's the new risk.
That's right.
Yeah, that's right. Vicky and then Glenn, Phil.
Could we just go back to the question, in the submissions, I think by Andrew, and that was the section 124 having been lifted on his property, the 5 Sarah properties below him, and potentially some of the ones around him, does that mean that the danger for them is not now as high as previously assessed? And it's probably a geotech question, Ian.
Look, our opinion is that there is an increased hazard danger to those areas. The Section 124 notice was put on at a very high level, saying that there were certain very strict criteria. In other words, a boulder coming close to or past the dwelling. But other areas, due to the work that Port Hills Geotech Group did, basically advised us that these areas have the same components, so they were therefore at very high risk. So we would, our approach is to keep those on until that hazard risk can be mitigated.
So if the risk is not now there on the Andrews property.
Sorry, I disagree that the risk is not there.
Right, okay.
There is a risk there. It's whether it's an acceptable amount of risk, and that was the debate on the 124. So that's...
But that's the same life risk, isn't it?
Yep.
So they've said that the life risk is not over our threshold.
I'd have to check with Don if they actually commented on the on the amount of life risk. So.
Don?
I knew someone was going to put me on the spot. Pass the buck. I can't recall the exact wording.
I know that Phil knows the exact wording because he's sitting behind going, ask me, I know the answer.
Tell me, Phil, what was the wording?
Wording of the...
Come forward, Phil.
The wording of the orders in council, which changed the Building Act, was if there is a risk, then the S124 should remain a risk.
No.
MB determined there was not a risk. No risk at all.
Right, okay.
Sorry, I'd have to disagree with that. You cannot say that there's no risk at all.
No, but,
Right.
but the thing is that, I mean, but again, this is another question that perhaps we should get an answer to, which is because it's about tolerable life risk, and it's about that, what's something that I can never say, 1 to the power of
10 to the minus 4.
10 to the power of minus 4. And so we need to find out whether the Section 124 notices were lifted because that threshold wasn't met.
Could we just clarify?
Yeah.
Yes, but please be aware that, and I'm not a geotech engineer, but what we do know is that individually, in the same way that there are properties, and I've explained this to council before, because when you look at it in the detail, there are properties which can sit next door to each other and have quite different levels of risk.
Yes.
So simply removing one because there are unique circumstances that MB have looked at doesn't necessarily mean that
I
that
totally
generally
get that,
applies.
but the question remains, have we re-looked at the ones that Sarah owns on the lower area?
No.
No.
In Consavi Place, not as a complete review.
Are we intending to do that?
No. Well, Sarah are the owner of those. That's something they would do if they wished to.
Yeah. Glenn?
Thank you. My question's over the basis of the report. Obviously, you said before you've arrived at your recommendation and it didn't fit certain criteria, so that you're not actually saying it, mitigation can't be carried out at all. You're saying in terms of what you're asked to do for the report, which is area-wide mitigation, that in your view, it doesn't stack up.
That's correct. I mean, and that's the reality. The council could choose to change whatever parameters it chose. If it wished to fund more than 50%, that would change the parameters. If as we tried to test with the Minister, if Sarah properties were to be included, that may change the financial equations. But working on the parameters that we adopted, that's the answer that we came to. Yep.
Is that both? I mean, it's not just that you include the Sarah properties, but make the Sarah properties available for the mitigation process?
Yes, they would have to be come into being a. The benefit would accrue from them being available to be reoccupied.
That's right.
Or to be rebuilt on. That's
right,
correct.
Yeah. So it's a bigger.
It's bigger than just being included. Correct.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. And I noted that that parameters could be changed, such as 5.2 over the cost benefit ratio. In terms of costs, Phil Elmy talked about $100,000 before, if I remember you correctly, Phil, for rock protection. You talked about 100,000, and then said figures here are in the millions. So I'm just curious as to how that figure.
Excuse me, sorry, we can't have.
Yep.
I did allow you to respond to a particular issue, but.
And two words, extraordinary discrepancy, have just come to mind. So I just wonder how we can explain that discrepancy between 100,000 and I think 2 million.
Well, you use the word discrepancy. There's a difference in figures, and we don't. I'm not sure how Phil has constructed his figures. I'm very confident about how we've constructed ours, and Dave can speak to that if you want. But as we've outlined, for us, it's around the type of engineering work to be undertaken, and as I've pointed out, looking not only at the construction costs but the maintenance costs and the whole of life costs. And I think if there's one lesson that we learnt from the earthquake is that actually the reality of maintaining a high level of protection up there is addressing whole of life costs, not simply the cost of erection.